Okay, thanks, Ed. Despite the renewed interest in Marxism that there's been in recent years, it's relatively common to hear people involved in the fight against oppression to say that Marxism is of little or no use because it's reductionist. And when they say that, what they mean is that Marxism in some way prioritises questions of class and class division over other divisions in society that are characterised by discrimination, such as race, gender, sexual orientation and disability, for example. That, I want to argue, is a terrible distortion both of the theory and practice of Marxism. Marx himself knew well the cancerous effect of racism upon workers in Britain. So appalled he was at the division between English and Irish workers in the 19th century that he wrote, "This antagonism is the secret of the impotence of the English working class despite its organisation. It is the secret by which the capitalist class maintains its power, and that class is fully aware of it." That's to say that Marx believed that whilst such divisions between different groups of workers existed, it was impossible to talk about workers as a whole taking power. In another quote, Marx argues that long before women had won the right to vote in Britain, Marx was arguing against chauvinism in the workers' movement and calling for women to be admitted into the very leading bodies of the international working class organisations, saying, "Everyone who knows anything about history knows that great social revolutions are impossible without feminine ferment." And Marx didn't seek to impose any kind of oppressor's moral code upon people who were fighting back. During the 1857 Indian Mutiny, which was, by all accounts, an extremely bloody affair, Marx wrote, and British newspapers at the time were filled with horror stories of what was being done by the beastly Indians to the Brits. Marx wrote to defend the insurrectionists, and he said, "There is something in human history like retribution, and it is the rule of historic retribution that its instrument be forged not by the offended, but by the offender himself." So, it should be no surprise that from the earliest times, Marxists who followed Marx have thrown themselves into the battle for liberation. From Eleanor Marx, who organised women workers alongside men in East London at the end of the 19th century and wrote a crucial pamphlet on what she called the women question, to the role played by the Communist Party in the 1930s in America, which really set up the basis for a civil rights movement in the 1950s. The ground was completely set by the role of the Communist Party in the 30s, to the fight against Margaret Thatcher's anti-gay Section 28 laws in the 1980s. Marxists have played a crucial role in all the key battles against oppression that there have been. So this idea that Marxists really are only interested in class, I think is a nonsense. It's not in the theory nor in the practice can this really be argued. And I think the tradition continues today. If you think about what the fights that the SWP is involved in recent years, the fight for disability rights and against welfare cuts has been an absolutely vital strand of our work. And we certainly don't say to people who are involved in campaigns over the disability living allowance or the independent living fund that really your battle is all very good, but without the power of workers, you're going nowhere. Rather, we see the possibilities of fights over benefits igniting wider class confrontations, and there being a possibility of an interaction between class battles generally and specific issues around disability, and that both can reinforce each other. And if you think about another key strand of our work, the fight against Islamophobia and anti-Muslim racism, if you think that, is it the case that when the Birmingham schools Trojan horse affair emerges as an attempt to bash Muslims, that our position is that we support only working class Muslims who are involved in such a battle, or that we make our support for Muslims in that situation conditional upon them being working class? Absolutely, absolutely not, which is exactly why our teachers are in the front line of fighting over this question at the moment. So both in campaigns, and in both campaigns, we demonstrate that in practice we're prepared to work alongside people, even those who are a long way from us politically, whilst at the same time trying to put forward our own analysis of what the problem is and how we should respond to it. In reality, much of the criticism of Marxism is not really about reductionism. It's a useful label for people, but it's really about how we understand the origins of oppression, what drives it forwards today, and therefore what methods are best to combat it. Marxists differ from others who fight oppression in one crucial respect. We don't believe that oppression has always existed, either because it's inherent in our biology or in some ways hardwired into our psychology. Instead, we look for a material basis to explain the divisions that emerge and the ideas and practices that seek to justify them. If we take racism as an example, if racial prejudice was a feature of human nature, then racism would be an unchanging and permanent feature of all human societies. But not only has the nature of racism changed as societies have developed, there's ample evidence that for most of human history, racism as a structured prejudice simply did not exist. C.L.R. James, the great Marxist scholar from Trinidad, put it like this: historically, it's pretty well proved now that the ancient Greeks and Romans knew nothing about race. They had another standard, civilised and barbarian. And you could have white skin and be a barbarian, and black and be civilised. The development of the structured prejudice of racism didn't emerge, it emerges with capitalism, and a key phase within capitalism, the transatlantic slave trade, which took off on a massive scale when Portugal, Holland, England and France began growing sugar and tobacco in the colonies in the 17th century, and soon the demand for labour was such that they were looking to Africa to supplement the numbers of European indentured labourers that they had brought over and who often died rather quickly. The slave traders had previously looked to ancient and Roman texts to justify their actions, and they said that, you know, you could justify enslaving someone who was captured in a just war. That was one of the ways in which you could morally justify slavery. But it was very difficult to stretch that definition that they'd used to the hundreds of thousands of people that were now being transported in the most horrific conditions from Africa. In what way could you argue that they were the product of a just war? And the thinkers of the Enlightenment that held all men are created equal, and who talked of the rights of man and so on, were in a quandary. How could they explain away the fact that their prosperity was based on the permanent enslavement of millions of people? Their answer was that Africans are not men, they're animals, and therefore the rights of man don't apply to them because they're beneath humans. Black historian Eric Williams hit the nail on the head when he wrote, "Slavery was not born of racism, rather racism was the consequence of slavery." And that's a very important point for us, because in later years capitalism transforms racism several times to make it a more effective tool for the system as it stands. Under colonialism, racism preached a kind of paternalism that said all colonial subjects were children, and later on, under the era of mass immigration, it becomes a crucial tool for dividing the working class. So rather than oppression being a static phenomenon that's built into the human psyche, what we see is that it's constantly being revolutionised, it's constantly being acted for and against, and therefore constantly changing. And that process of revolutionising ideas so that they conform to the needs of the system is something that Marx and Engels understood very well. In the Communist Manifesto, Marx and Engels write, "The bourgeoisie cannot exist without constantly revolutionising the instruments of production and thereby the relations of production, and with them the whole relations of society. All fixed and fast-frozen relations, with their train of ancient and venerable prejudices and opinions, are swept away. All new-formed ones become antiquated before they can ossify. All that's solid melts into air, all which is holy is profaned. Now, racism is a form of oppression that developed alongside capitalism. Women's oppression is far older, but it also developed as a consequence of a crucial change in the way that human beings subsisted. That is, the development of early horticulture, the division of society into classes, and a new sexual division of labour based on production and the need for a bigger population to sustain the new productive methods. Now, time doesn't allow me to elaborate, except to say that there are a number of very good meetings to be had here at Marxism on precisely this detail, and I hope people will be able to attend some of those. The point is that in both cases, the development of reactionary ideas, forming part of what Marx talks about as ideology, both emerge as a justification for existing practice, rather than the other way around, and that's a crucial part of Marxist thinking. The ideas don't come before oppression, the ideas come after as a mechanism for explaining oppression, and that's crucial because it helps you understand what the motor of history is. So why do Marxists focus so much on the question of class? It's tempting to think of class as just another way in which some people are disadvantaged under capitalism. So it's very common to hear people talk about race, class and gender as in one phrase, isn't it? You quite often hear them together, as though all three are really equivalent categories. One of the unique insights of Marxism is that it understands class as a relationship that's defined by the relationship of an individual or group to the means of production. That is, a worker is defined by the fact of exploitation, not by the fact of oppression. And that's a crucial distinction. See, Marx explained that through their labour, workers produce all the wealth of society, and that the boss's profits that fuel capitalism are derived from the way that workers are robbed of the fruits of their labour. That fact, of course, makes workers poor. It makes workers disadvantaged compared to employers and the rich, but it also makes workers potentially extremely powerful. And Marx's focus on class is not because we necessarily believe that class is always the most important thing in people's and individuals' lives. For a great many reasons, not least the actual experience of oppression, a person may think that their gender, their sexuality, their ethnicity, or whether they are suffering a disability or illness, is the thing that most shapes the conditions of their life, that most shapes their personality. That's not something that Marxists make their business to disagree with people about. That's a very important part of people's identity. But what we argue is that the focus on class is important because it gives us the potential to change society, to bring about to fundamental change, because it's in the question of class that we have power. And I want to say we focus on class for three very important reasons. First, seeing human history through the prism of class means that we are what Marx called historical materialists. To understand any given phenomena, we start from the economic base, the relations of production that emerge from that system of that economic base, and the superstructure that arises beyond that, which includes the ideas that seek to justify the way the world is. So, class is important in terms of analysing the society that we live in. For us, racism, sexism, homophobia and other forms of oppression have their roots in class society. They function in the interests of the system. And that means, this is crucial for us, that there are not two types of struggle, one against against exploitation and the system, and one against oppression. For us, there is one struggle against the system because the system forms the bedrock from which the other from which oppression arises. So that's one crucial reason why we focus on class. The second reason why we focus on class is that because we understand that the root of oppression is the system, we have to look for a force in society that has both a material interest and the power to challenge that system, and therefore the working class is absolutely crucial. Marx called the working class the universal class, not because everyone in the working class is the same, but because all working class people share a common relationship to capitalism and therefore have the collective power to abolish class society altogether. Workers have not only a material interest in getting rid of the system, they have, because they have that material interest because every day they are robbed of the value of their labour, but they also have a material interest in getting rid of oppression. And the reason is this: the divisions inside the working class make it easier for the bosses to divide us. It means that the worse the divisions are, the worse our wages are, and the worse our conditions are for all of us. And this is something that's borne out by a number of very good studies of the southern United States, which I'm sure you know is one of the areas in which racism is probably worst anywhere on the planet, historically. And what you find there is that where the levels of division between black and white are greatest, the white workers suffer lower wages than their compatriots in the northern United States. But what you also find is, and this is something that the US economist Michael White found, is that the greater divide between black and white incomes, the greater inequality between white incomes, i.e. the more racism that there is amongst workers, the more the rich are benefiting from that racism. So there is a material interest for workers to oppose oppression as well as to oppose the system as a whole. And there is one other very important reason why Marxists focus on class, and that is because class also divides the oppressed. That means the extent to which people face similar prejudices, obstacles and dangers because they are oppressed, the willingness of all people to say to trace the root of that oppression to the system and to draw the conclusion that we have to fight the system in order to fight our oppression is limited when people find that their privileged position in society, by being middle class and above, is derived from the fact that they have a stake in the system that's created their prejudice. And for that reason, we find that many mainstream commentators are much happier to have campaigns that are fronted by middle class people who suffer a form of oppression or have a middle class agenda. I mean, how often, this week, for example, if you listen to any number of programmes on the radio this week, you will have heard a discussion that's quite familiar about the glass ceiling that affects top bosses in the City of London. Now, why is it that they're not able to get into the boardroom to achieve the same level of pay as their male counterparts? Now, I'm absolutely against the glass ceiling in every respect, but why so much concentration on that question, but virtually no concentration on the fact that that over 750,000 women workers joined a strike of 1.5 million people last week to better their wages? Why no discussion of that? And the reason is clear. The question of class is much more easy, makes it much easier for the media to deal with the question of oppression when it can be presented as something that offers no real challenge to the system, something that can be contained, and that explains some of their prejudices in the way that they do that. But it's also true if you think about who's allowed to represent the oppressed. I feel very strongly that that Tottenham in North London is one of the areas where black people have historically faced some of the greatest levels of oppression in British society. Their MP, David Lammy, is treated as a legitimate member, representative of black people in Britain and from Tottenham and beyond. The US educated degree that he received and so on, gives him a sense of gravitas which they like. But he's allowed to go on after the riots and say one of the reasons for criminality amongst black young people is that they listen to too much hip-hop, play too many violent video games, and their mums and dads were afraid to smack them when they were young because of political correctness. Now, in what sense is he allowed to go and speak on behalf of black people as a representative in that way? It's because the media feel absolutely safe with allowing someone that they've created as a buffer between them and oppressed people to represent and narrow their interests. So, the Marxist focus on class is for three distinct reasons. One is, a class analysis is absolutely vital for analysing where oppression comes from and in whose interests it functions. A class analysis is vital for understanding who has the potential power to overturn the system, to bring about fundamental change. And a class analysis is vital because it helps us understand that there are divisions amongst oppressed people, and simply bringing unity of the oppressed is not enough, therefore, to end oppression. So, for those key reasons. So, how do we overcome the divisions that most certainly do exist amongst workers? What are the rivalries, jealousies, and downright prejudices that act to stop workers from seeing their true interests and therefore acting upon them? That's a crucial question for Marxists. Now, we understand that in order to break the hold of divisive ideas, we have to grasp what something that Marx called ideology. Put briefly, Marx said that the capitalist ruling class maintains its rule by force. Absolutely, they have a state, armed bodies of men, now water cannon on the streets of London. They've got the tools to use force. But if the state only maintained its power through force, it would be very vulnerable to attack, because the ruling class is very small, the state is larger, but the working class is massive. And so therefore, they have to find ways in which they can gain consent to their rule from the majority. And the role of ideology is to maintain and develop that consent. The worldview that it serves seeks to explain, justify and strengthen the existing set of relations in society. That's the function of ideology. And part of the strength of that capitalist ideology is that it generally doesn't acknowledge its own existence. So that you find within capitalism, ideas that are thought of as natural, as common sense, appear to us as though they are not ideological at all. So, it's plain common sense that if there are too many migrants in Britain, the economy will collapse. It's absolutely common sense that women are better at men with babies and children and families. It's only natural that the basic unit of society consists of a man, a woman and children. It's natural that Europeans dominate the academy and universities because they are the cleverest people. The whole set of ideas which are given to us and sold to us as though this is the natural order of things. Anything you do to try and change that is an interference with nature and the way things are meant to be. And these ideas may appear separate and unrelated, but in reality they are part of a systematic ideology that serves the interests of the ruling class. So why do people accept them? And Marx had a very clear understanding of that. He said, the ruling ideas are in every epoch the ideas of the ruling class. The class which is the material force in society is at the same time its ruling intellectual force. The class which has the material production at its disposal has control at the same time over the mental means of production, so that thereby, generally speaking, the ideas of those who lack mental production are subject to it. So what he meant was that if you control the factories, the offices, all the means of production, you control the system, you also have to control the ideas, because the ideology is what makes it function. And if you think about the mental means of production today, the schools, the universities, the publishers, the presses, the media more generally, almost all of it remains entirely within capitalist hands. And as the ideologies that they generate are not just simply ideas, they're backed up by physical force. So if you think that the racist idea that young black people exist in a culture of criminality, which is something you can read in almost any daily newspaper any day of the week, is backed up by the fact that if you're driving through London, you will regularly see groups of young black kids being stopped by the police. The ideas and the action reinforce each other and play a crucial role in that respect. But capitalist ideology is not just simply a conspiracy. We don't have a group of the ruling class coming to meet in a room like this and saying, right, what's the most divisive idea we can think of, then how should we propagate it? It works on a much more sophisticated level than that. The ideas are indeed instigated and have their origins in the ruling class, so you can find with the question of racism, you can't explain the development of racism without looking at how it emerged as an oral tradition from amongst the planters, the people who controlled the plantations, who sought to justify the inhuman treatment that they saw with their own eyes. It starts there, but then it percolates wider through society. And as these ideas find their way out into the world, they're mediated by different layers of people. The ideas are built upon, modified as they grow, change, and they are so that the ideas operate with a certain amount of independence from the economic base. They're not absolutely restricted to whatever the needs of capital are, but at the same time they are constrained by it. So Engels writes, political, judicial, philosophical, religious, literary and artistic development is based on economic development. But all of these react upon one another and also upon the economic base. It is not that the economic position is the cause and alone active, while everything else has only a passive effect. There is rather an interaction on the basis of economic necessity, which ultimately always asserts itself. So Marx has actually a very sophisticated analysis of how the ruling ideas come to dominate us, rather than thinking that there is a capitalist conspiracy, which is the caricature of the way Marxism is presented by these people. Marx has a very intricate understanding of how the ruling ideas come to rule us. The great weakness of capitalist ideology is that it often fails to correspond to the actual lived experience of working class people. It's all very well to have these ideas, but lived experiences are often much more powerful. I mean, I don't know about you, but I've on occasion met people who have recently had a child born, and the child is in some way has disabilities. And it completely changes their worldview from people who maybe at one time accepted the idea that benefits had to be cut, had to live within your means. Suddenly the world, as seen through the eyes of a parent who knows that the struggles that their child is going to have, suddenly changes absolutely enormously. But you see, similar things happen when people start to go to work and they work alongside someone who's gay and they've never met a gay person before. Suddenly this picture, the stereotype that they grew up with, that they've lived with all their lives, is challenged in the form of someone who sits next to them or at the same table, or has their lunch with them, and so on. And the stereotype can no longer function adequately when set against real life. People can be forced to reappraise them. So how do we, what that creates is what Gramsci called a contradictory consciousness. That you have on the one hand ideology, which seeks to impose a ruling class view of the world, which justifies the ruling class's position in society and so on. On the other hand, you have real lived experience, which seems to contradict at least elements of the ruling class's vision. The two things exist in the individual's head. Gramsci calls this contradictory consciousness. How do we resolve the contradiction? If, as many privilege theorists argue, that we accept that people have to break from reactionary ideas before they can engage in any kind of practice, then really what we are saying is that we are stuck in an endless loop, whereby workers cannot act to change society because they're too racist, sexist and homophobic, but because they are too sexist, racist and homophobic, they've been unable to change society. In which case you may as well say, game over. We're totally lost. Marx, however, had an answer to this. He was able to say that class struggle can play a crucial role in the breaking of reactionary ideals. Because capitalism forces workers to fight even for the basics of life, it generates battles that can clarify and test ideas and break the hold of stereotypical ideas. In the process, people who've accepted some of these false notions can be forced to reappraise them. So class struggle opens up the possibility of changing people's ideas. But if there is nothing automatic about this process, if there was, we could just sit back, couldn't we? Arms folded, wait for struggle, struggle takes away oppression, job done, which would be great. Unfortunately, something else has to happen in order for such a process to take place. There has to be at least a minority of people who are broken with capitalist ideology as a whole and who accept some form of socialist world outlook. This minority can vary in size from time to time, but in certain situations, even a small group of these people can win the leadership of many, or sometimes even most, of the working class, and that's absolutely crucial. Even if those workers, their consciousness remains contradictory or mixed. In every battle there has to be a group who not only argue the best tactics to win, but who tie those tactics to wider social questions and show how they are linked, so that we don't just have the best ideas to win this particular dispute, we try and show how our dispute is linked to wider social questions that we are concerned with. Now, the degree to which it is possible for people to radically alter their views in very short timescales is dependent on scale. I mean, the size of the battles that we're talking about. Because workers' consciousness is closely related to their confidence, the less confidence workers have in their ability to bring change, the more they're likely to accept dominant ideas in society, especially those that divert their anger towards scapegoats. Large confrontations raise far more fundamental questions about the way workers see the world, not simply because of the numbers involved, but because the question of who runs society and why are we not running society comes to the fore. And in such circumstances, people begin to understand that they can't possibly take power as a class if they remain divided by what Marx called the muck of ages. So there is a battle inside every struggle, but within the working class, there's a battle in which socialists are absolutely engaged with in order to try and turn every class confrontation into a wider fight over the questions of oppression and the nature of society. But there's also a battle by socialists inside the struggles against oppression. First, over those three questions: the question of what the origins of the oppression are, in whose interest it functions; the question of what group in society has the power to end oppression; and the question of how oppressed people are themselves divided by class. Perhaps the most important way that Marxists are different from all others who fight oppression is that we set our goals incredibly high. We don't want some corner of the world where it's safe to be gay, where it's safe to be a woman, where it's safe to be disabled, or where it's safe to be black. We don't want little pockets of society where we can feel free, because we know that those pockets don't last for long. Those pockets can be withdrawn at any time. We want an entire world free of discrimination and prejudice, and that means for us, the fight against oppression is a central part of the class struggle, and that the class struggle is the only way to win true liberation. Marx summed it up like this. He said, "The proletariat can and must emancipate itself, but it cannot emancipate itself without abolishing the conditions of its own life. It cannot abolish the conditions of its own life without abolishing all the inhuman conditions of life of society today, which are summed up in its own situation." Comrades, Marx set out the battle for us, and that's what we're engaged in.
I want to share with you a little experience that happened to me on my way to Marxism. I went and bought a ticket, and I said, I better put it in my bag that I don't lose it. That's okay, the guy said to me. Old working class women are always losing tickets. We're used to it. So I said to him, you forgot to mention I'm short. Why did you forget that? So, and he sort of looked at me, and I said, you forgot to ask me my ethnic makeup, because, you know, then you could have been a bit, you know, discriminated a bit, or a bit more and a bit less. I said, actually, I come from a Jewish background, but I'm not a Zionist, and my great-grandmother was black. Does that influence, you know, my He then closed his window and walked away. Was I impressing him, or was he impressing me?
Well, I was gonna wait, but now that the question has come up, I do want to answer. Well, I had the same experience really, because I was walking on a street market, and there was this newspaper salesperson, and he approached me and said, well, do you want to take some, or do you want to fill in the form so you can receive it? Because you can get free oven hand shoes, you know, for baking. And I was like, I don't know if I want it. And then he toppled the offer with, I have a scientific magazine for your boyfriend. So I got this picture of my boyfriend reading the magazine on the couch while I was baking a pie or something. I was like looking at him like, serious? I think that's really sexist. But the thing is, people don't think it is, because it's programmed in their head. It's like what you mentioned with the ideas. They actually write these ideas, and they don't see a person in front of them. They don't see a personality, they don't see intelligence. They just see a woman, a worker, and they just project it on them. And what you mentioned before about people finding themselves next to a gay co-worker, or, you know, often you see these struggles of ideas in their head because they have this general idea of a black person, a gay person, and then there's this concrete person sitting next to them, and sometimes they escape by saying, you're not like the rest, you're the exception. And then as a Marxist we should say, no, they're the real deal. There are all kinds of different persons. And this is why these ideas are really ridiculous. But yeah, the way to start is by, indeed, don't take it when someone comments on you like that. Just make a smart reply, but, you know, also start uniting. And well, yesterday I was at a meeting, I might repeat something now, but there was someone who said that during a strike there was this team of miners going past houses. I just have to repeat it because it's brilliant. And one of the miners was really racist, and the other one didn't like to hang around with him because there was all this racist bullshit. So they got a house, and the Pakistani women opened, and it was really poor inside, and she had 2 cans of soup, and she gave the 2 cans away like, we are with you. And the big miner came outside, racist one, and started crying. And when I heard that, I was like, oh, that's really when ideas break down like that, and we should work about that.
That was a really good talk. I just wanted to give an example of one of the ways in which the ruling class made sure that the truth about oppression doesn't ever really come out. And that is the story of Freud, when he discovered the background. He came back to Vienna after studying in Paris, saying, I now understand, my theory is that the reason why all these women are having emotional problems is because they suffered childhood trauma and probably childhood sexual abuse. Well, he was completely shunned by Viennese professional society. This could not be accepted. I mean, you couldn't say that about the family. It couldn't be that prevalent. I mean, that couldn't be going on. You know, fathers would not do that to their daughters. You know, so Freud had a choice. He could either recant in order to maintain his professional career and standing, or he could maintain his campaign to expose the extent of violence towards children and violence in the family. and he chose to recant. And wrote that I was mistaken, these stories of sexual trauma that my patients are telling us are only fantasies, they're only imagining it, and that he developed this whole theory about how children desire their parents, sons desire their mothers, and daughters desire their fathers, and this is all fantasy. And this has had a huge impact in terms of strengthening the oppression of women and children, to the extent that the disbelief of victims who come forward, the common belief that rape and sexual violence is really minimal in society. In 1975, the comprehensive textbook of psychiatry estimated the prevalence of rape as 1 in a million. That was 1975, and that was the textbook in the United States. Right? You had the false memory syndrome, people saying, oh, they're just making it up. You have the theory of the seductive daughter, the seductive child, who just wants to have sex with the older person. You have police investigation, rape investigation units that are called the Lying Witches Unit. And this continual denial of the extent of violence against women, against children, which, comes from the legacy, not just of Freud, but of the willingness of the ruling class to pick up certain ideas, which then deny that oppression exists, that to uphold the family, to uphold the institutions of capitalism, and that prevent the truth from coming out.
I just wanted to talk about a number of instances of socialists fighting against oppression. I was reminded of one of them by the comment from the person who talked about, older women are always forgetting things and so on. Because at the last conference of the National Union of Teachers, there was a motion about there's a tendency amongst schools to push older women teachers out of teaching. It's quite common, a lot of casework around defending particularly older women teachers. And people have put this motion, people who would say they were of the left, saying we have to defend women because when they go through the menopause, they have these problems and therefore we've got to campaign to support them. And our guys, members of the SWP, got up and said, no, hang on a minute, the reason that the mob bosses are trying to get rid of middle-aged women is not because we get to a certain age, our hormones go funny and we start forgetting things. It's because we're older, experienced, bolshy trade unionists who won't just go yes sir, no sir to any new initiative that's thrown at us. And that's why we've been pushed out the door. And actually we won the conference on the basis of that argument. It was a really good, it was a really good discussion. The other couple of things I wanted to talk about was one, I've forgotten the middle one, but never mind, I'll do the last one first. Was about around the the second one was also around schools. Is about the question of sexism in schools, because high level what's been called the hypersexualisation of young girls and women in music videos, the access to pornography, etc., and the influence that's having inside schools. And one of the things that we're doing through the Hackney Teachers Association, we're launching a conference to actually start to discuss how do we take this on in schools, because you go back to the 60s and 70s and people actually campaigned around the question of anti-racist, anti-sexist education, which was something that kind of became established, and I think we're actually having to go back now and really look at that and how do we start those fights again. The last thing is on the question of the unity of the oppressed, which I think is quite important, because there is no automatic unity of the oppressed. And actually, what the bosses will always try and do is use the different oppressions against each other. You look at the Trojan horse investigation in Birmingham, actually, what do they try and do? They try and use feminism, they try and use LGBT activism to try and get other sections of the oppressed to line up against the Muslims. And one of the things that we did was to launch an open letter. I don't know if people saw it, it did actually get published in The Guardian, from LGBT activists inside who are involved in education, saying that we're not going to fall for this hierarchy of oppression and allow LGBT rights to be used to bash Muslims and increase Islamophobia. And I think that's a really important role, that those are 3 examples of important roles that Marxists have played in opposing oppression.
I work in a job centre in Spark Hill, and the people sometimes say that black people or Asian people are somehow peripheral to the working class. In the job centre I work in, something like half the workforce are Asian or black. And if we had a racist union, how are we ever going to get unified industrial action in that situation? it's being anti-racist isn't a question of. I mean, it is partly it is a moral question as well, that I don't like racism. But it isn't just that. If we're going to have successful fights, and we've got my union's PCS, if we haven't got anti-racist policies in the union, how are we going to appeal to the black and Asian members of staff? Well, the union rep before me, he used to go around saying, "Oh, Muslims won't strike." Well, if you have that view, how are you ever going to get strikes in a workplace which has got half the workforce are Muslim? So, but in fact, really, he was saying that nobody would strike. So, but he didn't kind of try and operate in the rank and file and build strikes. But if that's your view that Muslims won't strike, how are you going to get the industrial action? So we have anti-racist policies. Maybe some workplaces are all whites. I don't know in the civil service, but many workplaces aren't, especially in the big cities, which are often the stronger parts of the union. So if we're not taking these kind of issues seriously, we're not going to appeal to all our members. So we have anti-racist policies because we want to see a unified working class fight back.
My name is Volker Mosler. I come from the Left Party in Germany, and I experienced that within the Left Party we have two sides which connect to each other. The one is on this subject of the relation of oppression and exploitation. The one is the economist argument, which would say if it comes, and the other one is the sectionalist argument, which would argue oppression has nothing to do with exploitation, it's an independent thing. And it's very often the same people who would argue along one or the other line, depending on the subject. When it comes to sexism, people would be sectionalists. Yeah? They would argue there's no connection with class issues. When it comes to Islamophobia, they like economism because they don't want to confront it.
Yeah.
Because it's unpopular. You can't get any votes with it. So this is not this is a funny contradiction, but it is very common. And my favorite quote from Marx is from the introductionary remarks to the founding document of the Fourth International, where he translated, I haven't got the English bit. The source of all dirty forms of knechtschaft, which means serfdom or oppression, is exploitation. Therefore, if we want to do away with these forms of oppression, we must dig out its roots. This means abolish exploitation by man through man. This I think sums it up very, very well. And because he makes a difference between cause and effect, we as Marxists are very often it is argued that we are reductionists, because we say the economic is more important, or the cause of the oppression. But this is of course wrong, because if you speak about an illness, say a certain virus causes death, death is not less important than the virus which causes it.
Came from Sheffield. I mean, what I want to say kind of follows on from your example, because I want to talk about a strike I was involved in the early 90s in Sheffield, where 400 mainly part-time women workers, part-time because they're women, very low paid, were told they were going to take a pay cut. And I was fairly new to socialist politics, a new shop steward, helping out with it. And in terms of a lesson of how struggle changes people, it was absolutely fantastic. So what we saw was a mass meeting after we'd won the ballot on the day that the strike was going to start, where people were sat in the hall, very, very nervous. Can we do it? Can we not? Big debate. They then marched out of the hall, round to the town hall, gathering confidence as they went. And they were supposed to just have a rally outside the town hall. They decided to stop that. They walked into the town hall. They occupied the town hall library, stood on tables and demanded the neck of the male councillor who's basically enforcing the pay cut. And the transformation over an 8-week, full-time, all-out strike was absolutely phenomenal. So what we saw was women going, who've never spoken publicly, weren't shop stewards or anything like that, going around in delegations across the country, into workplaces, into trade union meetings, demanding support. Over 8 weeks, they raised £90,000 to support their strike, and they won every single demand of the strike that they went on. And it was absolutely fantastic. But actually, when Yuri talks about things not standing still, he's absolutely right. What we then saw subsequently was it was a Unison strike, the Unison leadership on the eve of Labour being elected, attacking Sheffield branch amongst others, suspending the branch, weakening the union organisation across many of the unions as a consequence inside of Sheffield, and actually seeing the organisation that we built up on the left over many, many years starting to disintegrate as it gave management the green light to attack our terms and conditions and our services. So what we see now, when libraries are threatened with closure, being turned into, voluntary run community outlets, all that sort of thing, is a letter from a Labour council that says to the male, women, part-time, low-paid workers, you're not allowed to even speak out because you're employed by the council, you're not allowed to criticise your employer publicly. And of course, because of the attacks that have happened over the last 10 or 20 years, they're absolutely frightened, so that the community campaign inside of libraries is run by community members, and none of the workers are prepared to turn up, and a union leadership that isn't prepared to encourage them to turn up either. And therefore, starts to say, what's happening to you is okay, the cuts are okay, we haven't got a choice. So it is absolutely important. I don't want to have to, every 20, 30 years, have to go back through that campaign, because what we want to see is a situation where we actually take that forward, and we actually say we're going to work for a society where the gains that we have take us further and further on, and we end up with a society where we don't have to fight in a cyclical way in terms of cuts and in terms of the attacks that people experience. It's good enough, it's great that we have that strike, but it's not good enough. We want more. We want a society where we don't have to look back at that as anything more than history. It's a history lesson, not something we face again.
Just very quickly, really, just about the media. I mean, I don't watch the TV anymore because I'm fed up with it, but I listen to the radio, and Radio 4 particularly, and Radio 3. Now, on Radio 4, on the Today Show and on the news, yes, Radio 4, when the Trojan Horse debacle went ahead, even after the research had shown, major pieces of research had shown that there was no question that this was a bogus claim, they carried on repeating the problem of education in Birmingham and the whole thing about Muslim schools. Even after all these reports have said there's no evidence whatsoever to support this anonymous bogus letter that came from nowhere. They have no idea where it came from. That's one thing. On the question of child abuse, they claimed without any challenge at all that the child abuse in schools is taking place in state schools. They didn't mention the private education, the independent education. It's state schools, and it's the National Health Service. It's not the private hospitals. They're trying to blame state, our public services, basically, and say that it's going on in public services. They dismiss or ignore what goes on in the private schools and so on and so forth, which I'm sure is actually worse than anything else I can imagine. The Today programme this morning put forward another claim that huge numbers of foreigners are coming into this country and they're not paying their car tax. And this is resulting in as though there are people, nobody in this country, the indigenous society doesn't pay their car tax. Yeah, but they're blaming foreign workers, again, for the crisis. It's foreign workers not paying their car tax that results in a loss of £3 million a year, I can't believe this, but it goes unchallenged on Radio 4, on the mainstream news and the Today programme and so on. I'm fed up with listening to the BBC now, The other thing I challenged, I wrote a lecture about this, was that there was music of the First World War, and they kept calling it the music of the Great War. It's not the Great War, it was the First World War, and a brutal war at that, and they don't mention that either. With the deaths of millions of innocent people. So we need to challenge the BBC and the rest of the media.
about, I think, how in the last few years, I think we've seen a growing wave of struggle against oppression, particularly in universities. I've been a student for the last 8 years and I'm finally getting out at the end of this year. But I think in that time, I have noticed a shift where you see that class actually is playing a much bigger part in how people are articulating their struggles against oppression. And I think part of this is because many of those who are part of movements against oppression, I think one of the sort of most significant ones that we've seen in the last couple of years are sort of movements globally against rape and sexual violence. So in the USA this year, you see a lot of students putting red tape on their graduation caps in protest against the universities not doing anything about rape allegations. In Oxford, also in the last few months, we've seen last few weeks, I guess, the Oxford Union, which is like a private members debating club. One of the president of there had rape allegations made against him, and there was large protests against that. And I think, but what you see feeding this into this is that many of these people that are participating in these protests have become particularly active through anti-austerity, through the student movements. I think that will shape how people are fighting against oppression. I think that's something as Marxists we should take real encouragement from, that there is a growing number of people who appreciate that, like, you don't just fight for women's liberation, you don't just fight against homophobia, that these things are all connected. And I think that that's something that is very important, and therefore it's important for us, I think, to be part of these struggles and movements, because to be able to then sort of say, okay, we see these things are all connected, but why are they connected and how do we fight against them? And I think that's the sort of very crucial role that Marxists can play in drawing together different parts of the struggle, but also encouraging a sort of systemic analysis of what's happening and how we fight against it.
So after Catherine, please.
My name is Catherine. I'm a new member to SWP Edinburgh, and I've started to dip my toes into all sorts of theories, so thank you, Yuri. And also I was thinking about some of the things Karen had said earlier, and I just want to make two observations about where your theories fit into my bubbling ideas in my head. One is about how people are trying to justify why we're better together and not vote yes, and they are coming up, and it's all the powerful people like David Cameron and Barack Obama and David Barlow, you can look it up. But anyway, we are not fighting for nationalism, we are fighting against austerity. We're not pulling out of the working class struggle. We want the working class struggle in Scotland to be an emblem across the world, so we just want to make that point. So that's the ideas get twisted, and our voices are being hidden by the BBC. They always rule out Alex Salmond, they don't talk to people on the street. The second thing is about unity, and I noticed Bee's here, she's a member also of the Social Work Action Network, and there's a real campaign about mental health in crisis. One of the principles about Swan is we're an alliance, service users, trade unionists, and ground force workers. It's a great alliance, and it's that bit about actually the politicians don't open on the political agenda, and workers have to stick to wages and conditions. We've got to fight for everything now. Thank you very much.
Cheers. I wanted to talk about some of the contradictions when sort of Yuri talked about the ideas of society are rooted in the economic system, because that's true, but there are also contradictions in some of the ways that happens at the moment that I think can confuse people. So you look at racism, where there's a clear anti-immigrant focus at the moment that's about trying to foster divisions, so that when there isn't enough of anything, instead of blaming the bankers who've stolen it all, they want us to blame migrant workers. Or you look at sexism, where they still want to claim that women's priority should be childcare, and that's partly about getting you to look after children for free, for nothing for them, or to prioritise it. But at the same time as that, where their priority in both those examples are around trying to foster the divisions within the working class, there are people on the right who argue against some of that. So you see people like Tony Blair, who's argued recently that actually the free movement of labour in the European Union is a real advantage to capitalism, and that's something that we should support. And there's an element in which people can think, well, is he actually standing up against the racism that you hear? Or you see sort of the way that the Tories have used benefits to force women who, as soon as your child is 5, I think it was actually brought in by Labour, but it's certainly been continued and driven, but that forcing women with children to be on unemployed benefit rather than sort of parental benefits, and to be looking for work that doesn't exist and then taking them off it and all the penalties associated with that. And again, we want the right of women to work, and that idea that women shouldn't just be focused in the home is something that could be seen as being progressive, but it's being attacked from a very right-wing point of view, sort of using sort of anti-oppression idea, sort of, arguments to justify really right-wing stuff, because they're not arguing that migrant workers should come here with full employment rights, with the right to a decent wage, with the right to sort of permanent contracts, and all the things that we want for people, whether they're migrant workers or indigenous workers. They're looking for them to actually weaken trade union rights and to come with those divisions, and that's the basis on which they're doing it. And similarly with sort of encouraging women to work, it's not that they're providing any free childcare to enable that to happen. It's where women who will work spend an absolute massive chunk of their wages, parents do, in order to force you, because of the little bit extra that you get by working, that's about trying to exploit the most out of us. And I think working your way through some of those right-wing uses of what can appear to be actually progressive is actually a very right-wing, without conceding to women should be at home and back to the home, is actually can be quite sophisticated and difficult at times.
So next contributor will be the final one. Sorry if I missed you out.
Okay, Jim Fagan from Walthamstow. What I want to say as well, because I think there's been a tradition of Marxist tradition about dealing with oppression. It's been kind of buried actually. But I just want to start with Eleanor Marx actually, because this is from day one. When Eleanor Marx became active, she was organising not just women workers in East London, but if you read Rachel Holmes's book, actually, she was organising shop workers in Hammersmith. This was a new industry, these new department stores bringing in women. And when I spoke to her about this, she said there are other examples from her that she couldn't put in the book, for example, typists. So, from the beginning, Marx has said we have to organise men and women. It isn't this kind of stereotype image about it's got to be all engineering workers. That's from the beginning the kind of the way that Marxists organised. And I want to go on about the thing is, because to be quite honest, there are many people that really identify oppression at the moment, but they're despairing about change. It's really sad when you read the review of Laurie Penny's book. It's really sad actually. But because I think Marxism does give that the key to understanding that collective action changes everything. And the example I want to give is the match women, because again, this was something buried actually. But what we now know because of what the work that Louise Raw has done, which she's going to speak later, the match women strike were Irish women in a context where a few years earlier in East London there'd been a riot on a building site when they brought in Irish workers. So these women, they organised a strike, they went, a victorious strike from below, and they helped form, really what became the new union. So the collective action has been there from the beginning, but you've got to understand why it's kind of been buried. You can't find out about the match women even really properly from Eric Hobsbawm, and that's because it's the people who led those strikes and went on, for example, to lead the Dockers strike, which is a fantastic example that came out of the match women strike, Irish workers again. The leaders of that went on, Will Thorne went on to become a Labour MP, Ben Tillett went on actually to recruit people for the First World War, because they actually still turned to Parliament or changed from above, and didn't realise that change always comes from below. That's our tradition, that's the Marxist tradition, and we need to argue and win, because our movement is not strong enough. That is the way to deal with not just class exploitation, but the route to challenging oppression, replacing with a better society.
Thanks for the excellent discussion. I just want to make a couple of points really. One is Karen raises a very interesting question about Blair and the rights of free movement of labour, which I think it does can quite wrong foot when you hear that on the radio, can't you? has done me. But I think it's important to realise that the ruling class quite often has contradictory interests. On the one hand, sections of the ruling class are absolutely dependent upon flows of labour from across the world, and they rely on it to make their profits, particularly, say, if you're involved in food processing, agricultural work and so on, and seasonal work, which requires large numbers of workers to move from one side of Europe to the other side to coincide with harvests. They're a group of bosses who have a very real material interest in the free movement of labour. There are others who have, engineering projects and so on, who require very skilled workers and so on. So there's at least a section of the ruling class to whom the free movement in labour is absolutely crucial. But it's also the case that the ruling class knows that without the divisions in society, which keep the majority of people regarding each other as competitors and enemies, and people who drive down wages and so on, that without that division, the system as a whole can't function. So if you want to find out the reason why it seems that sections of the ruling class can seem to be arguing with each other about this question, it's not just that they have different points of view, which have just materially popped up into their heads. Rather, there's an actual very differing set of interests that affect the ruling class. When Marx talked about the ruling class being a band of warring brothers, that's an example really of how that war can play out in practical terms. I was very interested to hear the comrade who talked about the example of how in universities a number of students who've been involved in fighting oppression now see class as more important and begin to see the links between different oppressions. That, of course, is an absolutely important development and something which we are very much in favour of. However, if what's going on is that people are adding class to a list of oppressions which they are now concerned about, then the advance is much more limited than it can seem on the surface. Because what I try to point out in my talk is that class is not simply just a new category of oppression that people ought to consider. It is both the mechanism for understanding where oppression has come from, in whose interests it exists upon, and it is also the key to understanding how we can get rid of oppression. Class is not simply another item on the list, it's the mechanism by which we can overturn the whole rotten edifice of oppression. And that distinctive question about class is, it seems to me, the sole responsibility of Marxists to inject into the fight against oppression. No one else will argue this. On a range of oppression politics, we will find allies from across the different political spectrum, but especially on the left. No one else will argue about the centrality of class to getting rid of oppression. That's our unique responsibility, and it's one that we have to take incredibly seriously, because when we do so, the possibility of igniting some of the most explosive struggles in history is before us. So when B talked about, on a relatively small scale, how a group of workers, women part-time workers, become radicalised in a very short space of time, I'm reminded of much bigger struggles that took place in America in the 1920s and 30s, where the fusing of race questions with class questions led to social explosions which took America closest to the kind of disruption that it had been since the Civil War. You talk about whole towns rising up against both exploitation and oppression. Those struggles have the capability to blow the lid off the system, which is exactly what we want to do. And that's the tradition in which we stand, but something which we will find ourselves in a minority in most battles against oppression. Yeah. Nevertheless, it's something we have to be prepared to argue for. And what we hope is that this course will arm us all to enter those struggles with the confidence to be able to take on exactly those kind of arguments and patterns.